live by like a certain time.
Okay, we are on. Well, good afternoon again. Because we are streaming this, every time you have to hear me say, I'm Terry Freeman. Oh, I have this mask. I'm Terry Freeman, Executive Director of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, and we are thrilled to have you all still with us for this Reading as Resistance book fair. Now, we are going to have a final conversation, intimate conversation between Heidi and A.J. Verdelle. I have read Heidi's bio, so I'm not going to read it over again, but I am going to say I think this is going to be a wonderful way for us to close out our book fair, and I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to introduce A.J.
Thank you so much, Terry. I think I'm not on.
Yeah, I think I'm on now. Okay. A.J. Verdelle, I'm so excited I get to introduce you and interview you. But let me give the bio first so people know who you are. I already know who you are. A.J. Verdelle is an award-winning novelist and essayist. She's a recipient of a Whiting Writers Award and teaches in the low residency MFA program at Lesley University and teaches undergraduates at Morgan State University. She remains a working mother and feels confident that the Western genuine cowboy will eventually have a life in print. Verdelle won 5 national prizes for her novel, The Good Negress, Algonquin Books, 1995, and is the author of Miss Chloe, a memoir of a literary friendship with Toni Morrison. Please welcome A.J. Verdelle. So this book that you've written has been called Intricately Lyrical, and it's essentially a love letter about your friendship with the literary lion Toni Morrison and your relationship to language and art and the written word, and it is stunningly precise and poetic. And on a personal note that I just mentioned a little bit, it's a book that has inspired a little bit of an inner revolution for me to be able to get my heart back into my writing and my work. And now I'm nervous. But let's start from the beginning.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me? Nope, we can't.
What should I do?
He's going to help you out.
I don't want to touch it really. You need a red light in order to speak in this world. But I just want to say that I'm excited that you're having a revolution, that most of us write to inspire people, so that is like a wonderful starting point.
Yes, definitely. We'll start with your first book. I know we're here to talk about Miss Chloe, but we have to talk about The Good Negress first. You've called it the little book that could. Could you explain what you mean by that? Because it kind of relates to the story of how you came to know Toni Morrison.
Okay, well, maybe some of you heard of the title, The Little Engine That Could. It's a story about a train, and the train car keeps working really hard. It's a children's story. And so when I call The Good Negress the little book that could, it's because it's been in print for 27 years. And when the license expires, somebody else goes and buys it. And it's taught in colleges. And so while I've been raising my kid and while I haven't been publishing, to see your book still going along and to see people still recognize you because of it, even though 20 years have passed, that's why I call it that.
And how was it that that book was your connection to Toni Morrison? Can you explain that story a little bit?
Sure. So as the panel was discussing before, there's a lot of sort of inside conversation that goes on in publishing about which books are coming out and whether they're going to be good and who should support them. And so Toni Morrison was on the board of the National Humanities Center, And one of the people who got a galley copy, an early copy of The Good Negress, was on the board of the National Humanities Center, and he invited me for an interview, which I went to in North Carolina, and he held up the galley and he said, "This isn't a galley, this is a gift." And he sent it to Toni Morrison with that inscription, and then she read it, and she decided that she wanted to send in a positive comment, which she didn't say on blurbing. She just wrote to the publisher and said, "This book is truly extraordinary." And then the publisher said, "She knows she's blurbing, that's why she sent it, she knows exactly what we're gonna do." So they took those 2 words off and put it on the cover. And then Toni Morrison actually had her secretary call to invite me to come visit her.
This is like having God call you all of a sudden from the pearly gates and, "Hello,
It's true.
AJ,
It's
come
true.
see me." Tell us a little bit more about that first meeting.
Right. Well, it's true that it was like somebody calling from the heavens. And it was my first entry actually into the world of people who can call you and say, "Come," and you come. Right? There are not many people who could do that. Even my sister. I'm like, why? Why does it have to be today? You know? But Morrison calls and says, "Come," and you go. So I was in New Orleans, and we made a date, and I traveled all the way from New Orleans. I had all these, I'm going to take the flight, I'm going to stay with my mother, I'm going to then take the train to New York, and then and I went really early to the meeting, because I'm always late. So I was like, I'm going to be late for 2 hours early. And I went early, and I walked up and down the street, paid attention to which bell. I was very, very nervous. And I was very dressed up for me. And so there she was in this 3-level loft in Lower Manhattan. I mean, it was like
This is
more
the
money.
Tribeca loft we all saw in the magazines.
Right, it was the Tribeca loft when she first bought it. Anyway, we had a lovely meeting. She was lovely to me. She was warm, she was funny. I thought there would be a bunch of people there. It was just Toni Morrison and me. So thank God I had thought through what I should say, because I had to say a lot. But then at the end of the meeting, significantly, she basically demanded the scarf that I was wearing, which was really the whole dress-up thing, right? I had on black and white, but I had this beautiful scarf. And she said she was cold and kept staring at my scarf, wouldn't stop staring at my scarf, so I finally offered it to her, and I never got it back.
Now, tell me, the scarf that you never got back, was that kind of the reason you kept going back? Because I'll be honest with you, I ended up with my husband because I pretended to leave a sweater with him once.
That's a good strategy.
And
it worked.
And how did the friendship continue after that day? How do you know that you're now friends with this literary lion, this woman that you've always admired growing up?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do you know? I think that because she kept calling. I mean, I thought our first visit was lovely, but I also did anticipate it might be a one-off. But then after I gave her my scarf, I was like, I told her, I said, "This is my favorite scarf. Please give me my scarf back." And I would visit when she called, and I think 2 or 3 times I did ask for the scarf, but it was clear I wasn't getting it back. And I don't know, I was like, "Well, did you lose it? Did you lose it? Just tell me you." And she's like, "I'll give you your scarf back." So I kind of thought she was wearing it. But anyway, because it was beautiful. But anyway, she continued to call me, and I just eventually stopped asking about the scarf. So I knew we were friends because she continued to invite me to visit. And so she would invite me to places. When she would read, there would be gobs of people. And so in public, I didn't really get to spend much time with her, even though she did invite me. But she would also invite me to her. I think I went to every house she had.
You talk about a lot of the one-on-one time you had with her at her house in the Hudson, here in Manhattan. And during that one-on-one time, you got to know her very well. You described her as funny, cryptic, surprising. And I'm wondering if you could share an anecdote or two that exemplifies any of those words or all of them together.
Okay, well, cryptic is like when you communicate really briefly and really shortly. So Toni Morrison really was very good at shutting down complaint, or she would make you feel like you were being unreasonable. One of my main, because I have this theory, I think that Toni Morrison is the James Brown of literature, right? Like, she invented I'm Black and I'm Proud. And although her language was lyrical and erudite and highfalutin, as was her imagination, she still did so much for us as a culture by what she was willing to put on the page. So anyway, I'm talking to her one time about music, and I'm talking about rap and how it drives me crazy, and she's like, that's nothing new. The old generation always hates the new generation's music. So there's nothing else you can say, right?
Right, yeah.
So that's what I mean by cryptic, but it's also profound, because it is true. My mother hated the music I was listening to. Her mother was like, what are you talking about, that music? You know, I remember when we used to have protest music, the Marvin Gayes and the, I don't know,
Curtis
War,
Mayfield.
What Is It Good For, Curtis Mayfield, all that. And then when the music turned back to love, I didn't know it was back to love. And so I thought, the music is going to hell in the handbasket, you know, we need love, you know. So music changes, and we all hate what's coming. And she was, you know, so she would slice into the conversation, so you better be ready to go on to the next thing.
Now, I know you don't tell any tales out of school. I mean, these are measured stories that she's told in this memoir. But what would surprise us most as readers and students of Toni Morrison's work? What's the thing that we would be most surprised by about her?
Bye, thank you for coming. And I said bye, thank you for coming. I'm serious. It's okay, I'm serious. Thank you for coming. Toni Morrison was extremely serious about Black people. She was extremely serious about her work. She was extremely serious about what she wanted you to know that you could become. So I don't think most people think that. I think most people think that she's about lyricism, that she's about storytelling, but she's serious about revolution. Because it's a revolution to recognize that Black people are treated as if they are not people still. We're treated as if we don't feel pain. We're treated as if we don't have a psychology. We're treated as if we don't think. And that's what Morrison has on the page. Black people responding to trauma. Black people thinking their way through this thicket of our experience. So she was very serious about the internal revolution that it takes to be who God made you. That was her deal.
So I want to talk a little bit about the writing of the book, because it's not just about Toni Morrison, it's about you and the way you came in to becoming a writer and to your love of the written word. And in an interview you said that you wrote this book feverishly, and you were so glad to be able to be in bookstores again and have a book that was on the shelves currently. So what does it feel like to have this book out now? And as a follow-up, what's going on with that cowboy novel?
Okay, so publishers were interested in this book about Miss Chloe because they felt like I was one of the few people who knew her separate from her work. And they bought it thinking it was going to be like this grief experience, this processing of grief. In fact, one publishing group dropped out because they could see that they wanted me to go through seasons of grief and sort of write it for a year. Publishers have ideas about what they think you're going to do. Anyway, when I said no, that's not even my style, seasons of grief. So they dropped out, right? But anyway, I did think I would be grieving, but then as I wrote it, I started to feel like, wow, what a huge gift I had, right? When I started to think about all my experiences with her, I thought, gee, I was so lucky, right? So I started to get giddy, kind of, as I got into it more. And I realized that there wasn't really anything to grieve. I mean, in fact, I was so glad that she didn't have to deal with the pandemic, because she was in rehab, she'd been in the hospital. And let me tell you something, Morrison, without people visiting her, that's not a sight you want to see. So I got giddy in the middle of it, especially when it became clear that I actually had enough to say, because when I started, I thought, I was sort of like her little friend.
Well, I understand it started off as an essay for the New York Times and kind of portioned from there.
Well, I talk a lot in this book about Princeton, which is where I taught on the faculty with her, which I did because she invited me, but I didn't know that. The department chair at Princeton College invited me, and he was a white Irish poet, and he didn't say, Toni Morrison wants us to invite. He said, would you like to come to Princeton and teach? And I was feeling so guilty because I was like, absolutely. Not because I want to go to Princeton, but because who's going to not go be on faculty with Toni Morrison, right? If I see her once a year, it's better, right? So anyway, I went to be on faculty with Toni Morrison, and she continued to invite me to things. And so in the middle of the book, I thought, you have been given an incredible gift. And so I tried to turn the book into a book that would transmit that gift to other people, right?
It definitely does that. And I'm wondering on that note, could you read a little bit for us?
Sure.
I think that would be a good time.
I'm going to get up and stand at your podium. Is that okay? And then I'll put this down. Is that all right? It's easier for me to read that way.
It's your podium now.
My podium. Okay. So one of the things Toni Morrison and I had in common is that we respected older people. She talked a lot about her parents and older people in her life, in her community, which is how I came up with the name for her, Miss Chloe, anyway, relative to older people. So I don't know if any of you know this book, I Dream a World, but it's a book by Brian Lanker, has pictures of heroes. It can have a picture of you in it. You'd be standing looking so fierce, and you would talk about yourself. So in that book where Morrison talks about herself, she says the following. I remember myself as surrounded by extraordinary adults who were smarter than me. I was better educated, but I always thought they had true wisdom, and I had merely book learning. It was only when I began to write that I was able to marry those two things, wisdom and education. When I turned in the manuscript of The Bluest Eye in 1968, Morrison is still talking, there was a lot of interest in certain kinds of Black expression. But I had written something separate from the harangue and the confusion. So there are two commonalities between Toni Morrison and me. One, I too remember myself being surrounded by extraordinary adults who had an answer to almost everything. And I had read more, and I knew this as a young person, I had read more than most of my grandparents would read in their lives. But they knew way more than I did, and I felt it acutely all the time. The second is, I wanted to write something that was separate from the harangue and the confusion. And that's the way our country approaches us. It's like we're going to harass them into insanity, and we're going to make their lives crazy, right? We're going to say, you can't have a good job, and then we're going to ask you why you're poor. That's confusion, right? So Morrison and I were like simpatico on both these issues. So I'm going to read to you a little bit about how, when I was getting to know her and learning about her, these things sort of interwove in our experience. So this, what she just said, harangue, confusion, extraordinary, wise Black people. This encapsulates our lives, our home experience, our ventures out into the world. In our homes in Black America, efforts are made like Hercules to keep wretched oppression at bay. Inside our homes, we try to keep the oppressors and their insanity outside the door. In the larger world, only the struggle, only the insanity, only the harangue is of interest. our speaking, protective, wise ancestors at our own peril. Few of us were dismissive. Mostly, we watched, we studied, we learned. A Black woman who has lived to her wisdom years has been through some things, some thickets, has likely been witness to a whole host of crimes. An aged Black woman peers at the world from the corner of seen before and for shame. A Black woman in her wisdom years sees and speaks shrewdly. She may shriek. A silver-haired Black woman has met peril in the daylight, has stared him down, and has strode on through. You have to march to keep up with the program. She knows what's important. Keeping the pace persistently must be part of how we play the game. Life gives us teams, but there are few substitutions. A Black woman who has lived to her wisdom years knows what's important. She has hidden from and stood up to the harsh realities of scarcity, of refusal, of race prejudice, of gender mistreatment. She has often grown into sweet serenity or fierce toughness. When I met her, Morrison was learned and literate and ascendant and entering her wisdom years, reaping the rewards of decades of work, imaginative writing, dogged revision, ruthless historical queries. She had demonstrated devotion to the grace of creativity and dedication to the tasks at hand. Either she was deferential to her blistering imagination or her imagination-made demands. Morrison showed the world what Black America makes. Compared to Morrison, I was a youngin', but I learned about women of Morrison's age growing up with my chorus of grandmothers. My sisters and I were girl children cooking in a wisdom stew. Those children whom people called old souls, I was not one of those. I was precocious, rambunctious, curious, and occasionally querulous. I asked questions and created theories using surprising vocabulary for a child. I made arguments no one expected. When I was very young, I mixed up the creative and the true until I understood fiction defined. And then I realized that fiction is a whole world, a matrix, an industry, a whole set of strategies separate from but similar to reality. Fiction is far more than telling stories. Fiction is architecture, daily visitation, imagination brought to the table and given soup and a crown.
That's so beautiful. It actually dovetails with this question that I have that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll have the audience ask you some questions. But the book is also a book about the craft of writing, and it's about the teaching of the craft of writing. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how aspiring Black writers, whether young or old, like me, can find the teachers they need and learn the lessons, whether it be technique versus imagination, to tell the stories they need to tell.
Okay, so you're right. It's about writing because Morrison and I were both writers, and Morrison cared about writing, I think, after Ford and Slade writing, period. And I really cared about writing, even though I don't think I learned as much about writing from being around her as I did from perceiving how much she valued her own work. So it made me go back and study the work again. Because if you wanted to get her attention, you say something about Sula or Paradise, and immediately, she put the pizza down and started to talk to you. But also, I tried to watch her as she taught writing, and her position was that if you're going to do this, you need to be serious about doing it, right? If you say you've read someone, what is it that they're doing, not just with their story, but with their writing? So those phrases that I read, fiction is architecture, it is, it's construction. And you have to approach the elements of writing as if they're as serious as construction, right? If you forget the rebar, or if you don't call in the engineer to figure out what the weight load needs to be, your structure's not gonna stack up. And that's also true of writing. So that whole idea about imagination and technique, which I talk about quite a bit in this book, you have to know the difference. And you have to know that the things that you imagine, and you know, for fiction writers, everything is imagined, right? It's a blank page. And when you put something on the page, all you're really putting on there is ink, right? So the fact that somebody is looking at that ink and sees a character, a child, a crisis, is because of the writer and the skill that they've developed about, well, if I'm gonna make this crime believable, what do I have to show of it? How much do I have to show of it? How long do I have to hold the moment? So James Baldwin said writers have 80 million decisions to make, so get busy, right?
Haven't heard that one.
Well, he said it. And it's true, because you're making the decisions about the words, the decisions about the punctuation, the decisions all the way up. Setting, character, crisis, crime, collapse, redemption, all those things have to be decided and then redecided when you're revising, right? So the idea about where you find your teachers, well, your best teachers are the writers whose work you love the most, because that's the work that your mind says, oh, this is the thing I want to do. This is the thing I want to make, except for me, it will be this. In mine, it will be that. But still, the thing that inspires you, you got to deconstruct it. You got to say, this is my favorite book. Here's how it works. This is where it starts. This is where it blows up. This is where it ends. This is how many characters. I can't tell you how many books I've diagrammed.
Actually diagrammed. Is this
Yes.
part of your statistician background that you want to like get it down in numbers and codify it?
I want to figure out how that contraption that is a book is working. And once you become a writer, you realize it's kind of a contraption. It's people put together in a place that they may or may not know, that you may or may not know. And we all think when we write that we know what's going to happen. Just like I said, I thought I would be grieving. But once you get going, the work starts to engage with you and tell you what it is, right? So then, and Morrison talks about this, she actually, I don't know if any of you have read Song of Solomon. It's Barack Obama's favorite book. He said the book Song of Solomon taught him how to be a man, which is a big thing for a book written by a woman, right? But Song of Solomon is about men. Paradise, her book Paradise, is also about men. But it's a contraption, and you're trying to put it all together. And so Morrison talks about how Pilate, who's one of the weirdest characters in literature, Pilate started to take over Song of Solomon. And she's telling Pilate, who's an invented character, this is my book. You have to stand down, this is my book. I will tell you where you fit in this book, right? So the books do start to talk to you, and you have to negotiate with that as the writer, because you're the person who has enough of a sight line on it to say, is this contraption actually constructed well?
Mm-hmm. On that note, before I get too personal and like close all of you guys out, even online, because I'm learning things here today, I wanted to open it up to our audience if you had any questions. Yes, please.
I have a question. It's a little personal, if you don't mind. I was listening to the passage in the book about who you listen to, who mentors you, who can help, guide you. And you talked about when you had gone to Princeton to teach alongside your friend and mentor. And right now there is, I'd like to call it a reckoning, but there's a pulling back of the curtain of the way Black women are treated in higher education, whether it's Dr. Hannah Jones, and Toni Morrison has just written a beautiful play called The Confederates about Black women in higher education. And I'm wondering if you guys had conversations about that, about what it is to be in that position, obviously with a name like sometimes you think they're untouchable. But I'm just curious about those conversations, not just collaborators in terms of writing, but I would just like to know if she had given you advice, or was there struggle there? And I know there's still a struggle. I'm here, and I'm an associate professor, so I'm in a department that I'm the only brown one. So I'm really interested in those conversations.
Well, Morrison, you allude to when you have a certain name, right? So I will say Morrison did float around Princeton. I mean, she wasn't confronted on many levels, right? At the same time though, she had interests, right? She was in a creative writing department. We had this strategy for creative writing instruction, and Morrison was bored. And so she decided she was gonna just construct a whole new format for teaching creative writing. And although ultimately other people participated in it, she called it the atelier, which is a French word that means workroom, but like a workroom where a carpenter might work, or like a shop almost. And so she turned her classes into these shops. And she would invite another creative writer or another artist and have the students work on a project with that artist. And so she would just be in the classroom. It was amazing because it relieved her of a lot of pressure. It took her out of this really boring workshop strategy that's been going on for 50 years. And none of us really like Morrison was very clear. She's like, I don't want to read your little story. So she's very, it was boring, right? But here was her point. Don't be confused. People will tell you, Black women are the engine of this nation. So therefore, when you're in those environments, you need to big up like the engine, which is what she did. She talks in the pieces